Hello and welcome to the Psychedelics Today podcast. This interview was recorded on March 16, 2016 with Lenny Gibson. Hosts on the show were Kyle Bueller and Joe Moore, me. On the show, we talk about Lenny's background. We get into how philosophy can meet psychedelics at times, and also a bunch about holotropic breathwork and how, in some cases, maybe how psychedelics are not necessarily inferior, but not the right tool for the job. Holotropic breathwork might be the right tool for the job in other situations. That's only a little bit of this episode, but we do get into that. So check us out at psychedelicstoday.com. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks. Bye.
Hey, this is fun for me. Anytime I get a chance to talk, and people will listen, I'm happy.
Kyle and I have spent a ton of time with you at your breathwork workshops, Dream Shadow, and we've even studied with you a bunch, and you and Elizabeth have helped us learn quite a bit about breathwork and human psychology. So we wanted to bring you on the podcast to talk to you about that. To get started, I guess, where would we like to start? You're from Pennsylvania? You grew up in Pennsylvania?
No, outside of Boston.
Did you? What part of the city?
It's a place called Waltham, Massachusetts, and which is known in history for having been the place where John Lowell established the first mill, which took in raw cotton and produced finished printed cloth at the other end. The Charles River provided water power, and that's what ran the mills. And it developed as an industrial city that became known for watchmaking. At one point, there were 8 or 10 watch manufacturers in the city, and one of them, Waltham watches, became the standard for the railroad industry. Every conductor carried a Waltham watch. Associated with the watchmaking is a precision machine endeavor, and associated with the watchmaking, a lot of other precision machinery endeavors developed. My father worked for one where they made gauges. This was before the digital, this was when things were analog. Gauges, for instance, that were used for measuring the internal diameter of a gun barrel. These gauges were sensitive down to 10,000th of an inch. And so with ordnance, you need very close tolerances to make sure that your ordnance is going to behave properly and that you can calculate the trajectories okay and that kind of stuff. He got exempted during the Second World War because he was working for a place that made precision gauges that were critical for the war effort. But after the war, watch industry moved first to Switzerland and then to Japan. The city was a small city. It was a city of about 50,000 people, and began to suffer economically. And when in the early 50s, when I was born in 43, 9, 10, starting middle school, place was economically in a recession. And then the Soviets put up Sputnik. The whole science endeavor became important to support. The other thing that was happening was Eisenhower had a heart attack, and treatment of heart conditions became important. And there was a guy named Dr. Sanborn who invented the first electrocardiograph machine. Nowadays, it had paper tape and a stylus that drew lines on it as the tape moved around. It was one of these first electronics devices were electromechanical devices. They used electronics and they needed mechanical stuff. So this was what then happened was out of MIT were coming ideas for electronics. Because they were electromechanical devices early on, they needed precision machinists to build them. And Waltham had this fund of precision machinists who were at least underemployed. As a kid, I remember if your watch broke, you could just always go down the street. There was somebody who could repair it.
Not so much these days.
Right. Yeah. The whole thing turned over, and the city began to grow. And then 128 was built. That was built when I was 7 years old.
And for those who don't know, that's a major beltway around.
Yeah, Silicon Valley around in the Boston area.
I work for one of those companies.
Which one? Which one, Joe?
Off air.
Oh, okay. Oh, in the high school band, we played at the groundbreaking of a company called iTech. That was the first electronics company on 128. And I found in my parents' stuff a copy, a mimeographed. This is back before Xerox. A mimeographed. It was like a college blue book, and it was mimeographed with the text of the speech of the governor as he spoke at the ribbon cutting for Route 128. And he was talking about how this would give people a chance to take drives in the countryside.
So this will be a fun transition, drives into the countryside.
So I was going to be an engineer.
Because then you took a different route.
That was the highest level that I could imagine achieving coming from a factory town. I couldn't make it in athletics at all. I aspired to be an engineer.
But then you ended up getting a doctorate in both philosophy and psychology, correct?
Right, the philosophy came first. Because I end of high school, close getting to the end of high school, applying for college, I had only one person, an uncle, had ever in my family lineage had ever been to college. My high school had one guidance counselor for 600 or 800 students. I got no. My mother had, as myself and my siblings had grown up, my mother had Cracker Jack secretary, but it stopped because while we were growing up, she started working part-time for a guy who had left Harvard, a physicist. He'd left Harvard in a peak because he hadn't gotten a Nobel nomination. And he had started his own company. And he had gotten a contract, the telemetry contract, for the exploration of the Van Allen radiation belts. When we were going to send up the first cosmonauts, there were these belts of radiation around the Earth, these sort of like miniature Milky Way things. And they were afraid that an astronaut would get fried going through the radiation belts. So they needed to map them. And what they did was they shot up rockets with fluorescing powder that would also sensitive to the radiation, so they could map out the radiation belts. And this guy got the contract for doing the telemetry that would record the data coming down they were taking photographs and, rocket trajectories and all that stuff. And he got the contract. My mother started working for him, and he liked her because she did a great job. And so she mentioned that I was, trying to figure out college. And he said, well, tell him to get some catalogs and bring them in and I'll help him. There was an article in Life magazine which ranked colleges. There was just a new thing that was starting. And so I just went to the list and ordered catalogs from about 20 places and went in to talk with him. And he looked through them and he said, well, I'd like to recommend Harvard, but he said, if you go there, you won't see a professor for the first 2 years. You'll see him at the end of a big lecture hall, but all the actual hands-on stuff will be done by graduate students. So he pointed me at Williams College. He said, because you'll get professors right from the very beginning. Fortunately, I didn't get accepted at Harvard because my good friend, who was a third-generation Harvard person, was selected. And this they wouldn't have taken two kids from the same town. And I had to put together my course schedule. I didn't know. And I was just going by the distribution requirements. I took French and English, and since I was going to be an engineer, I took physics and calculus. And then I had to take a social studies division course. And it was I just looked at things, and I arbitrarily chose philosophy over psychology because it worked better with the schedule.
Mm.
And in that philosophy course, I got this incredible teacher. One of I would put him on the same level as Stan in terms of his comprehensive.
And for those listening, Stan Groff.
And at that point, things like sociology and anthropology were just brand new disciplines. I mean, they didn't even have departments of them at the college. Or the college was basically, it was English and political science and science, just a much narrower range. It ended up that in philosophy and the psychology was all white rats. So it's a good thing that would have turned me off completely. When I realized that you had to do your homework every day in physics and calculus, I was a procrastinator.
It's important to note that this would have been around the early 60s, right?
Yeah, this is 61 when I graduated high school. So this is 61 to 65. But I became a philosophy major and read. We were expected to be widely knowledgeable. I mean, the fact that I was taking science and math courses was important because we were expected to know stuff all across the board. I mean, in a philosophy class, could just as well be talking about English literature, psychology, anthropology. I read more psychology in that philosophy major than I ever read in my graduate psychology courses. And this teacher was very knowledgeable about Whitehead. I mean, he had a background in science himself. And so he plugged into Whitehead on a very profound level.
And again, for people who aren't familiar with Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, British mathematician and philosopher. Was he the teacher of Russell, Bertrand Russell?
Yes, he was Bertrand Russell's teacher.
Mm.
And really, the philosophy is just beginning mainstream philosophy is just beginning to catch up to Whitehead. Whitehead was a guy who had discussions with Einstein about whose theory of relativity was more beautiful.
And I think for this audience, to give Whitehead a little bit of credibility quickly, Terence McKenna would say he was the most psychedelic of the philosophers. And for this audience, that might lend some credibility.
Yeah, and indeed. And that was my discovery.
So you had studied Whitehead before you had jumped into the psychedelic arena?
Oh, yes. In fact, if it hadn't been for having studied Whitehead, my psychedelic stuff might have driven me stark raving mad.
Mm. Yeah, you said Whitehead's theories were really grounding for you, right? Or it just helped you make sense of what was going on for you in those experiences.
So let me speak experientially. My first psychedelic experience was just with plain old marijuana, but it was much more powerful than is the average. Because, I mean, these substances are just triggers. Just a little bit of marijuana was enough to catapult me. And it lasted for several days. One of the Whitehead's basic approach was from the field of mathematics, logic, and physics. And he has a profound critique of mainstream materialist. He says two major things. One is that that time and space are abstractions. They're concepts that are abstractions. There is no actual something called time or space. Time and space are not actualities. They are abstractions. Like an inch is an abstraction from a mile is our abstraction from our experience of walking a distance. Okay, I mean, a mile is literally, from Latin, it means media possum, 1,000 paces. 1,000 Roman paces was a mile.
Hmm.
That's why a mile is 1,760 yards, is because 1,000 Roman paces figures out to that many. A pace was from the time your left foot left the ground till the time it came down again. So it's actually 2 steps. Okay.
Original metric system.
Yeah.
Original metric system. I said to you, go out and get me a mile. You can't. It's not an actual thing you can pick up and bring in. So a mile is just an abstraction from an experience of spending some effort to get from here to there. And Whitehead suggests that space is an extension of that abstraction. The notion of space is just an extension of that. You can't bring me a chunk of space. Okay? Space, we have an experience which leads us to talk about things spatially, but it's just our way of talking about a kind of experience. And similarly, time. You can't bring me a minute or an hour. Okay? It's just our way of talking about an experience of duration.
I think the best way we've talked about it, Lenny, is if you try to talk about it as if it's a concrete thing, you're making an error.
Which Whitehead calls a fallacy of misplaced concreteness.
Right. And I think that's important because if we're trying to get to the bottom of a lot of this material, psychedelic material or otherwise, like we do have to take that into account.
Indeed. And my psychedelic experience brought that home to me very powerfully. All of a sudden, I understood space and time were not realities, were not actualities, that they were part of a perceptual game. Talking about space and time was playing a certain perceptual game. 2 aspects of my experience. One were that time, in the sense of things seeming to happen, go along in time, all of a sudden that wasn't happening. There was no sense that time was happening. I was just in a place. I was just in an emotion, an experiential place that didn't have a sense of things coming and going. I mean, things were still coming and going, but it didn't have the feeling of something ticking off, some regular progression. And so with space, I mean, in ordinary, it's almost like you can see that space is a kind of fog, a kind of, I shouldn't say fog, but a very light mist that's between us and what we perceive. And all of a sudden that mist wasn't there. Things were immediately, in my experience, I could say it was on the other side of the room, but at the same time, the other side of the room didn't seem far away. In that experience, I immediately had Whitehead to refer to. I was saying, oh, this is what he's talking about. And he was not into psychedelics at all, but as he says, and he got there simply by thinking things through, by addressing the paradoxes of logic and mathematics and the problems of physics. He had that experience of time and space disappearing. And so that's his most profound, his base critique of mainstream science is that it treats time and space as actual things. It's not. And his other thing was about simple location. He said his other fallacy that he spoke was a fallacy of simple location. He jumped off there from the idea in quantum physics that a quantum you can't locate a quantum particle. In some sense, a quantum event extends throughout the universe. So he said here within even mainstream science, quantum mechanics shows us that there's something wrong with the notion of simple location. But still, mathematically, the physicists tend to think of even quantum events as simply located, even though the mathematics shows that they're more. But and part of the reason they do is they treat the events materially. That the only relation between atoms or quantum events is they're related externally. In the Newtonian world, they're like billiard balls bouncing off each other. But even quantum particles, they just interact with each other externally. They don't have a felt relationship to each other. And my other discovery was the sense that all of a sudden I felt connected to everything. I felt not that everything was inside of me, but that I could feel myself. I was connected by feeling to everything.
Mm. And this was still your first marijuana experience.
Yeah. And that was pretty exciting.
Yeah.
I quit my job and rode off in pursuit.
And is that when you landed yourself out in California?
No. That was my junior summer, before my senior year in college. I went back to college and began exploring the psychedelic world a little bit more.
And how did you get involved in that?
Well, the friend who turned me on to the pot, who had dropped out of school and gone to Mexico, dropped back into school, and I was hanging out with him. And he came by one day with a bag full of morning glory seeds.
Oh, jeez.
And he said, let's try this. He had a bag of morning glory seeds and a hammer.
Oh, wow.
How were the stomach symptoms?
Terrible. Awful. I couldn't possibly do it a second time. It was like so aversive. I mean, the experience itself was wonderful, but but my body, just the mere smell.
Did you do an extraction, or you just kind of ate the seeds?
I later, in talking with Sasha Shulgin, he suggested water extraction.
Yeah.
Apparently, there's newer methods that take the. There's still symptoms with the water extraction, but there's newer methods that take that symptom down a lot, from what I understand.
Yeah. Well, but it's kind of arbitrary, with psychedelics. I mean, they have different side effects, but the central effect is the important thing. So I barely hung on through my senior year. And then headed off to California for graduate school. At the advice of my department chairman, who said it was pretty hard to find any real philosophy anymore on the graduate level. He also steered me away from Harvard. He said, they don't teach, he had gone there, and he said, I'd like to send you there, but they don't teach philosophy there anymore. He said, go to Claremont. They're still doing history of philosophy. Well, by the time I got there, they were starting to move away from history of philosophy. But there were still a few people left in the corners that I eventually found some of them. So I got a little bit of real philosophy.
So we're not sounding glib. Harvard was teaching kind of like extensions on Bertrand Russell, like fancy wordplay and logic.
Analytic philosophy, linguistic philosophy, analytic philosophy, talking about word. It's like in literature, the deconstruction, the postmodernist kind of stuff, okay, where you don't look at for what the text refers to, but you just analyze the text itself. Okay.
And whereas you were hoping to study history of philosophy and the development of...
I was hoping to study the reality of philosophy, because in the people in my college department there were 4 or 5 people, and most of them actually thought philosophy as a way of life, as an attitude towards and a way of life, okay? Not as an abstract intellectual endeavor. Not as a way of learning clever arguments, but as a way of getting at the meaning of things. And that was one of the things that the psychedelic experience did for me, is it really plugged me passionately into the quest for the meaning of things. And I landed in California in 1965, which was when everything was beginning to happen.
You were in the midst of it.
I was in the midst of it. And although I was out in Claremont, which is a little ways out, but I had such a profound training in philosophy that I really didn't need to study very much. I would dig out I needed a paper. I'd go back and dig out an old paper and shape it up a little bit. But most of the courses were pretty thin compared to what I had experienced as an undergraduate. I mean, and Claremont is very highly rated graduate school, but I would say that I have never come across even a graduate philosophy department that was as good as my undergraduate department. So I spent much of my time exploring the culture, and the one intellectual, call it, so to speak, intellectual endeavor, the one thing I was doing with my, that involved books, that partly involved books, was Zen Buddhism. I had been turned on to that by Alan Watts. Well, my friend from college started me, and then I picked up on Alan. He got me reading Alan Watts, and I picked up on Alan Watts. And Alan Watts used to come by Claremont. I can remember sitting listening to him at his lectures, at his talks. He didn't lecture per se. I mean, I can remember just going in and not wanting to sit in the back, so just going down and sitting on the floor in front of the stage. And I met a fellow through his girlfriend who was Chinese, who had an interest in things Oriental. He was a potter. He's developed a national reputation since. He was just another guy at the time. And he was very interested in Zen Buddhism, applying it to taking the aesthetic into the pottery realm. And he got me studying karate, and we would go into this was at a time when there was still a real Japantown in LA. It was a real district in LA where there were lots of Japanese people. They've now all moved out to the suburbs, and Japantown is just sort of a little Disneyland kind of thing. But we would go in there to see the sword flicks. These are the samurai movies. And I can remember going once to one of them where Toshiro Mifune made a personal appearance. The movies were largely in Japanese with English subtitles. And Mifune could barely speak English. And I remember him talk, but the audience, he was just talking Japanese. There were no subtitles. He was just there, and there was no translation. And the audience was Japanese, and they were getting off on him. But the only thing I really remember from that was he talked about he had just acquired a rare sword, which had killed 103 people. So there was the hippie thing and the Zen Buddhist stuff, and they all kind of glommed together. And I found some really good books, and so to the extent that I studied anything, I was. There weren't any courses in Oriental stuff, and there was one course in Oriental religion out of there were 5 colleges in a graduate school altogether, but there was only one, and it was a terrible course. It wasn't worth. It was just. So I did most of my studying on the side, outside the stream of graduate school, and I didn't need to do much with my classes because I had already learned most of the stuff. But I did find a few people who were left over from old time. I found this guy named Philip Merlin, who was a philologist, and he had a joint appointment at Munich and Scripps College, and so he's this old German scholar, and he was one of the world's experts in Plotinus. But Plotinus was 400 years later was a follower of Plato's work, and particularly the mystical aspect of Plato. Plotinus didn't write anything himself, but his talks were transcribed by one of his students named Porphyry, who put them together in a book of 81 essays, as it were. And it was called the Aeneads because Aenea is the Greek word for 9, and even though this was Roman times, Greek was still the language of learned people. And Porphyry quotes Plotinus as saying that using the method of Plato, I moved to the realm of transcendence, which he describes in various ways as a place with the flight of the soul, where the soul makes the flight of the alone to the alone. And there's some really wonderful stuff in Plotinus. The method was you start contemplating beauty on various levels, from the aesthetic beauty of material objects to the beauty of laws and principles and theories, and moving towards the realm of metaphysics, and then jumping off the ladder, which is a method Plato describes in the Symposium for one place. He also describes it in the Republic, but it's most explicit is in the Symposium. So Philip Merlin, philology is it's almost disappeared now. But it was an aspect of philosophy where people looked at the evolution of words to help amplify their meaning. And this guy, we were our syllabus for the course, and there were only 4 or 5 of us in the course, was to deal with one essay per week. We met once a week for 2 or 3 hours, and we were supposed to do one essay each week. Well, by the middle of the semester, we had almost finished the first essay, because Merlin had, for every word, he could tell a story, and he'd take the word back through Latin and Greek and down onto Egypt and over into India. I mean, he just every word practically had this huge story of where it came from and how it was used in the ancient world. Just absolutely fascinating. And I also sat in once on a course of his on Aristotle, which was mostly taken by political science people, because somehow Aristotle had become fashionable in political science and nobody in philosophy cared about it anymore. But he did a whole class on a footnote to a translation of Aristotle.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is that where you learned your story telling skills from?
To me, stories, stories are where meaning resides. Okay, and if you want to learn something, find somebody who's going to tell stories because you'll remember it. Okay.
Yeah, I think every time I listen to your stories, I find new meaning, and I've probably listened to your stories a bunch of times. And every time I hear it, I hear something totally new that I've never discovered before, which I always find really interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's how my teachers impressed me. I mean, I just am following the model of what impressed me. So I did Zen Buddhism, and then I picked up these little scraps of history of philosophy that were lying around. And I did find a Whitehead course that was taught in the School of Theology that was nearby. It wasn't as good as the one I'd had as an undergraduate, but it covered more of the material. But the teacher was John Cobb, and he's pretty good. But his orientation is towards religion. And so, I mean, Whitehead did have an interest in religion, and he wrote a book about religion in the making, called Religion in the Making, because he was interested in values, but he wasn't interested in religion from the point of view of theology. But the result of that, one of the consequences of that course was for the paper for the course, I decided I wrote a paper called a Whiteheadian explanation of the LSD experience. And that turned into my dissertation, which I actually wrote in about 6 months because I was just writing about what I was experiencing and bringing in some philosophy to support it. But then there was sort of crescendo. It was 1970. The anti-war stuff was just peaking, and that was when Kent State happened. And just about every college and university in the country shut down. My orals were scheduled, and they never took place because the university was in such turmoil that three people, my committee couldn't even get together. And so they interviewed me sequentially, which was good because I could play each of them off against the other that way. My psychedelic experiences were extremely profound, so profound that I completely went over the edge. I dropped out of graduate school for a while. Fortunately, didn't get drafted because I came from a factory town and everybody volunteered, so that at the height of the war, their quota was just one. I was out of school for a year before they even got a hold of me, and by then I was back in school. From there, I spent a year in and by the time I graduated, I had taken the psychedelic stuff as far as I could. I mean, LSD experiences, which lasted for the last time I took LSD, it lasted for about 6 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
Was that scary to be in? How did you come back from that?
With great difficulty. I mean, I dropped out of school.
And is that when you met Stan?
No, that was, I dropped out of school, came back to Boston, was not doing any psychedelics whatsoever. I didn't need to. I mean, I was just there. Got involved with some people. We put together the first underground newspaper in Boston, held the first human bee-in, because I was from California. So I was bringing
California back to Boston.
California to Boston at the time, you know. But then I began to come down and fell into some rather profound depression. Was working in a garage, coming home covered with grease to a cold water flat, and finally decided, hey, I better go back to school because this is not my future.
Yeah.
That I want. got back to California, did the Whitehead course, finished graduate school, and spent some time with what I call minor psychedelic, like diethyltryptamine and MDA with a chemist friend.
And why would you call diethyltryptamine minor?
Well, because it's like only lasts for an hour or two. I mean, for me at that point, it just kind of reminded me
of the 16-hour or 6-month experience.
Without. I mean, I'd only get into occasional situations with it where I'm going, "Oh, who am I?"
Interesting. You never had like a full-blown experience of...
Well, I mean, to me, what full-blown is getting to a place where you don't know, as I heard Terence say once, you don't know whether you're Agnes or Angus. I mean, you just get to the point where the question of identity is like who am I become? It becomes you just get to that point where who am I? What's the universe? And I mean, this whole thing. What is it? What the hell is going on here?
Yeah.
I mean, even to be able to say what the hell is going on here. I mean, you can get. How does it happen that there are individual creatures
within that realm? You mean?
Just period. I mean, why is there anything?
Right.
Not only who am I, but why is there anything at all?
Yeah.
I mean, the traditional first question in Zen Buddhism is, "Who are you before you were born? Show me your original face," which translates out to, "Who were you before you were born?" Well, you can intellectually address that question, but when you really get it in your soul, it's not something you can deal with intellectually.
No.
And my sort of ultimate psychedelic experiences were always getting to that point of the incredible puzzle, paradox, absurdity of what the heck, what is this? I mean, is this?
I think that's the question we're all asking, right?
And then, and having to solve it, having to figure out what I am, just what it is to be, and it just going through this incredible insanity, trying to figure out how do I get back into the world? How do I keep from being hospitalized?
Yeah. How do you just do the normal things every day?
Yeah. But then when you get through that, there comes a moment. I mean, I remember, I think in terms of my that time I took morning glories early on, I remember, oh God, I want this stop. Please, please. I need a cup of tea. And so, I gotta find a mug. I gotta find a tea bag. Well, I got to heat up the water. Well, maybe I'll start with hot water. That'll make it easier. So I go and get my cup full of hot water, and I'm coming back with my cup. Now I got to find a tea bag. I got to get my immersion heater and put it in the cup. And what am I going to do? And I found myself drinking the hot water. I went, oh, hot water. I mean, that was like the solution to the puzzle. Drink the hot water, dummy. And I remember there was a record on the player. It was Thelonious Monk, and the composition was "Ruby, My Dear." It was something he'd written for his wife. And in that moment, when the hot water became satisfying, the music all of a sudden opened up, and Ruby, my dear.
That music could be a little challenging.
it's the only stuff that really engages me thoroughly. It's gotta. I mean, I like other stuff, but still, when I want, I mean, it's still Monk and Mingus that are the.
So, how did you bump into Stan's work? I know you were working at the VA for a little while in Boston, and then.
So I went from after graduate school, I came back east, got a job. It was hard to get jobs in philosophy at that time because it was falling apart, and there was an oversupply of graduate. So I spent a year teaching at a prep school for that was sort of right out of Charles Dickens. And then I got a job in Tulsa, being an administrator and teaching one philosophy course. And I was there for 7 years, and it was very, I couldn't, Tulsa, Oklahoma, okay, I couldn't do anything psychedelic in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And yet that stuff was the essence of what I was trying to get across to people in philosophy. But so I was wandering in the desert, as it were. I mean, I had made some friends and met it and had some interesting times, but academically, it was like, I mean, I wanted to deal with the deepest nature of things academically, and
it seems quite purgatorial.
Yeah, it was like purgatory, and then the dean I was way overworked. I mean, I was responsible for advising 1,200 people, managing all their records and giving them guidance on what courses to take. And I mean, I was working 70 or 80 hours a week, and not being appreciated at all. And then a guy who had been a former president and had been given a cushy job of teaching two humanities courses in involving ancient history, had a heart attack a few days before the semester started. And the dean looked at me and he said, "You know ancient history." And so all of a sudden I had an additional full-time job. And it just got so crazy. And the dean himself really flipped out. Shut up one morning in the office with blood all dripping down his shirt. He'd been in an automobile accident, and his steering wheel had broken off, but he'd refused assistance.
Jeez.
And he had driven back in, just holding the hub of his steering wheel. He had a very important appointment to get to. It was just totally loony times. And I decided I needed to get out. And the graceful exit would be to go back to school, because by then I'd been advising 1,200 students. So I'd gotten pretty adept with psychological issues. And I thought, well, academic philosophy isn't working for me very well. I'll, try psychology for getting at stuff. But it turned out it was hopelessly worse. But I studied up in psychology so I could pass the graduate record exam, and ended up at Austin, where fortunately I came across a guy who had been a clinical psychologist but had moved into statistics and stuff and computer programming, and I was interested in computers, so I learned to program computers and stuff, and used that. I took a few standard psychology courses that I needed to, but basically I spent my time learning statistics and tests and measurements and matrix algebra and all kinds of stuff like that, and got finished my classes, went to an internship. It was where ultimately I was told that I was probably going to get dropped from the internship because I was, and this is the official charge, I was smiling too much and getting along too well with the patients.
And can't get along too well.
Pardon?
What city was that in?
I was in Boston, at the VA in Boston.
Okay.
And in the midst of that, a catalog from Esalen showed up in the mail. I had never had one before. And Stan, I'd been reading Stan's books. I discovered Stan's books when I was in the transition from Tulsa to Austin. And I said, this guy knows what he's talking about. But it never occurred to me that I could meet the guy. Like, this is what I'm saying, Joe, just go in and you can meet him.
I actually did sit next to Roland at a conference in New York years ago.
Yeah.
He's a nice
just
guy.
A human being.
Yeah, great guy.
So
had you heard of Esalen before? Through Stan's books?
Yeah, I love it. But when I was in graduate, I couldn't afford to go there.
Sure.
Okay, they charged hundreds and hundreds of dollars. Now they charge thousands.
Still expensive.
Yeah, and so at Elizabeth's urging, I went out, and Stan and Christina were just beginning to put together holotropic breathwork. They weren't training anybody or anything. They just were doing it. And it was one foggy January evening that I walked in, and here was Stan lecturing on Descartes. And like it had been philosophy, psychology, how can you get it? I couldn't find my place in either one. And here was this guy who was like a god in my estimation, for having read his books. And he was lecturing, talking about philosophy in the context of psychology, and people were complaining that they came there to have an experience, and here he was talking about philosophy. But I was ecstatic, and but I said, "Hey, wait, I'm under suspicion. I can't do this stuff." And in my first experience with holotropic breathwork, I could see that it pointed in the direction that psychedelic experience led. And but I'm saying, hey, I'll never get my conventional degree if I get too involved with this stuff. I was already starting to have trouble putting a dissertation together because I wanted to do like I'd done for my philosophy dissertation, but that wasn't acceptable. So I spent many years before I finally, 6 or 7 years before I finally encountered Stan in Vermont and had an experience with the breathwork that was identical with my most profound psychedelic experiences. And I realized it was all the same stuff. And not too long after, and that broke things open. I've been struggling for many years to try and come up with a dissertation. That broke things open. I got a lead, figured out something, managed to develop a new relationship with my advisor, and I was the only dissertation student he'd ever had because he was into computers and stuff, and people in psychology don't like numbers. But we hit it off on that level. But he was going, no, it's gonna be behavioral science. You can't go on with this. So struggled, and yeah. But after that, so I'm doing a lot of shorthand here. But after that experience, I said I've got to study with Stan, and that was when I started moving in that direction.
Could you get a little bit into your experience in Vermont, your breathwork experience there?
Yeah. So Stan and Christina and Jack Cornfield were doing a week-long workshop, turned out in a couple towns away from where I live. And I had inadvertently learned about it because I had connected up with a woman named Jacqueline Small a year before that, when I decided I was going to give up on my psychology dissertation and just go back to breathwork. And somebody showed up at her workshop with a flyer that said Stan and crew were coming to Pulteney, Vermont. Oh, I said, hey, I gotta go. It's only 20 minutes away. And so I went. Here we were in the gymnasium of the Green Mountain College, and there were 130 people there. And when I had first encountered Stan, there were groups of a workshop was like 20 people at most. And I had kind of lost touch with the whole thing after, from being in Tulsa and then moving to Vermont and starting to homestead there. I was making my final effort to try and come up with something for a dissertation, and I had shipped it off to my advisor. Then I went to the workshop, did my first breathwork session, and then in midweek there was a break. I came back home, and there was a letter from my advisor written in pencil. And I'm going, what is this? This guy's been using a word processor, since the beginning, with PDP 10s, and that was an early mini computer, Digital Equipment Corporation, which doesn't exist anymore. And I'm reading a letter, and he says, well, I've got a detached and bleeding retina. And I'm going, oh man, if I lose this guy's going blind. What am I going to do if I lose him? I'm already at the end of all the possible extensions you can possibly get. And if I lose him, it's all over. And so I'm in despair. But I go back and I'm in my next breathwork session, lying on my mat, getting into the music and really breathing my guts out. And all of a sudden, my body starts becoming electrified. It starts buzzing, vibrating, buzzing. And I'm lying on my mat. I'm spread out. I got my hands out to my sides. And for some reason, I want my sitter. I got my sitter and a facilitator, one on each hand, and I want them to put their thumbs right in the middle of my palm and give me pressure. And I'm pushing. I'm practically lifting them. Okay, they're bearing down with all the weight, and I'm lifting. I'm lifting because the harder I push, the more ecstatic I feel. And the buzzing just becomes incredible. I mean, it just, and I'm pushing and pushing and pushing, and it just begins to, and all of a sudden, bang, the heavens part, and what I associate with Moses' encounter with the burning bush, the fire that burns without consuming. And all of a sudden there's this fire, this it's not giving off, it's not a fire that gives off heat, it doesn't burn anything. It's the fire that burns at the heart of the universe. That's the quintessence of creation. And I hear, but not with my ears, but because ears are only part of the hearing. I am given the deliverance that one, God loves you, but you're afraid of him. Stan loves you, but you're afraid of him. All your teachers and mentors love you, but you're afraid of them. Your father loves you, but you're afraid of him.
It's a really powerful message.
And when I just reported that to a couple of psychiatrists back at a conference in Washington. That's the beginning of this year. And one of them said to me, wow, 7 years of psychotherapy in 5 minutes.
Mm.
And so then I'm laying there in a puddle. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, well, that's good. That's pretty good. But I was feeling, I can't tell any, I don't think I'm crazy. I just this. But finally, I summoned my courage. I said to my sitter, could you go get Stan? And so he does. After a while, he does, and Stan comes over, and I sort of started burgling out all this nonsense. But Stan didn't faze him at all. He just gives me a great big hug, and I spent the rest of the week in just a daze. Really only but fortunately I made some friends in the course of the workshop, and there was a psychiatrist there who kept trying to trap me. But my friends gathered around and protected me and distracted him. And when I got back home, I called up my advisor, and he said, come on down, we'll figure something out. And so I went down to Texas, and we figured something out. Dean Rusk had just published his confessions in Time magazine, saying, yeah, the Vietnam War was a pile of crap. And so I got, and then I decided I had to go into the training, the breathwork training with Stan. So that's how I got started in breathwork training. And the key was, and as Stan himself said to me many years later, a number of years later, he said, yeah, that's what convinced me about breathwork too, is that I had the identical experience with just breathing that I had with psychedelics.
And that's what turned me on too. When I came down to your place for the first time, I didn't think anything of it after having like a near-death experience and having some powerful psychedelic experiences. I didn't think anything of it, and that first experience was pretty much all that in one, and really just blew me away. And I was like, "Wow, like it works."
Yeah, because I mean, you're just this is the reality. Okay, I mean, in being born, actually, that one of the first guys that's called a philosopher in the Western tradition says at one point, "We're born out of the boundless." And we eventually pay the penalty for having been born by returning to the boundless. That was Anaximander. Mm. So individuating in the face of the entirety, it's a fundamental alienation, but it's an alienation that takes place because the only way the universe can really enjoy it, the only way the totality can really enjoy itself is by becoming an individual. Okay? If you're everything, you can't enjoy everything because you can't go on a date with it, Yeah. You just so in order to enjoy, in order for the everything to enjoy itself, it has to become individual and differentiated from itself. And so each of us is the universe enjoying itself for a little bit of time. And we have to become finite, because if you're everything forever, what do you do on a Saturday night?
Exactly. Hmm.
There are no Saturday nights in forever.
How long have you been facilitating breathwork now?
We did our first workshops in 1994. So that's 22 years. 22 years this October.
Did you ever have a count on how many workshops you've done, or?
When it got in the vicinity of 200, I stopped counting. It's gotten beyond the point of counting.
Right. I first visited you guys in 2003. Kyle, when did you?
October 2010. Halloween weekend.
It's a good.
I think I breathed on Halloween, actually.
Yeah.
Good choice.
Yeah.
I mean, there is, things like that give me some purchase on astrology.
Mm. I would like to interview. We're talking about interviewing a guy that Stan worked with a bunch. Not Rick, the Canadian guy. Do you remember his name?
Ren Butler.
Ren Butler. He used to post on Hollow Interest, the email list, a lot.
Yeah, he still does.
Oh, good. I must not be on there anymore. I thought I was. But we'll talk to him. He seems pretty interesting and did a lot of analysis, retroactive analysis to see what the stars might do to your individual sessions.
A singular issue. I talked about how Whitehead, his critique of science was that science wasn't dealing with actualities. It was dealing with abstractions. That's a problem that astrology has. Okay. For the Greeks, the zodion were beings. They were ousia, beings. They weren't abstractions. And a zodion is a creature, is an animated agency. The agency, the question one asks in the face of people who want to push abstractions in science, when they want to talk about force as the cause of things, you ask about agency. Does this thing you are telling me is a reality, does it have agency? Can it do things of its own accord? And that's a way of, Whitehead's fundamental description of an event is it has agency and is the agent of its own becoming. Okay, so that which is actual has agency. And if there's, and that's why you not to get too committed to abstractions, because abstractions don't have agency. Whitehead says something like, expecting an abstraction to perform the services of a real entity is like sending an imaginary terrier after a real rat. Beatrix Potter has a great story about one of her characters is a terrier who goes after rats. And it's real, and that's what I always think of with Whitehead. Little thing there. Where's the agency? Where's the real terrier?
And that's an important point I actually learned from you about breathwork compared to psychedelic drugs is giving the breather, the participant, the experiencer, a sense of agency in the process.
The problem, if one has only experience with psychedelic substances, is that it's hard to realize that it's you. It's not the substance. Substance is just a trigger that allows you to access yourself. And the agency is in us. Okay, and that's why shamanism worked. Shamanism only using a drum. Okay, that's why chanting works. Because what they do, what all these techniques do is tap a fundamental quality of animate existence. That's the answer to the conundrum of where did the universe come from? It came from us. We can understand it comes from us. The universe comes from us every moment. If you want to know how the universe started, go within. You won't find it by looking through telescopes, because all you do is get back to the Big Bang, and then what do? Why the hell was there a Big Bang? Well, there are other universes. Well, okay, but I mean, why is there anything? And you won't find why there's anything by rummaging around in closets. And, each of us has at the core of ourselves, the experience of becoming ourselves. And that is the same. I mean, the universe looks like a big thing, but it's no more vast than Stan quotes that line from, there is a spectacle that is more vast than the sea, and which is the sky, and a spectacle is more vast than the sky, and that is the psyche. And maybe both there.
Yeah. It's a large inner world inside there.
Yeah. Or as Plato says in the Timaeus, the universe is so constructed that the center is the circumference. Mm. If you go into the center, you discover the circumference.
And I think with the breath work versus the psychedelics, it seems like we're always encouraged to go inside, where some like recreational psychedelic use might be kind of projecting it outside, getting...
Terry McKenna says, the only useful way to do psychedelics is you go into a dark room.
5 grams of mushrooms in a dark room.
Silent. Hi, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that interview with Lenny Gibson. That was just part 1. We have a whole bunch more coming soon. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes or Stitcher and make sure you don't miss the next episode. Share it with your friends. Thanks again for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.